just a quick book placement, product placement for my books under the author name Derek Hemingway. First, we have the first installment in The Human Saga, which is my epic trilogy of novellas about a future civilization of corporate fascism that is being invaded by an alien cult. We have The Mortician's Daughter, a dark fantasy set in Mesoamerica about a sorceress who blocks out the sun to create a kingdom of darkness and evil, full of ghosts and monsters. It's fucking awesome. Part 2 of The Human Saga, and then Part 3. There's currently my first full-length novel in the works, so be on the lookout for that. That's about all. That heathen bastard! Hello everyone, welcome back to That Heathen Bastard. And today we're going to be discussing some, I think topics that are of some pretty excellent importance at this point, at least to me. Remember that this is a show for talking points and a political platform. This is not a news show. With that being said, let us proceed. As a side note, at some point I might actually turn the show into a podcast. I know, obvious, jump the bandwagon choice, but I am a bit of a bandwagon jumper. Like, I have my React channel on YouTube. Yeah, that's joining the bandwagon. That's a React channel. You know, shout out to me as Nathan Song Snob. But anyway, with that being said, I wanted to talk about today about how basically lack of economic literacy is actually dangerous. Now, keep in mind, my independent studies into economics are not complete. And even if I finish my current text I'm reading, it's probably not going to be complete then. I got so much more to go. I'm a dedicated self-educator who's on his way to becoming the archetypal wizard. You know, I got to help the hobbits get the ring into the volcano, right? But suffice to say, I'm just beginning to feel like lack of economic literacy is dangerous. And I will specify quite clearly why I feel that is. First of all, I want to talk about traditional economic theory and its reception. Now, traditional economic theory, in many ways, resembles the concept of deterministic behavior, or behavioral determinism, being that libertarian free will is a myth, and that behavior is determined by selective pressures, that selective pressures drive human behavior. And if you actually study traditional economic theory, basically economic theory arrives to the exact same conclusion about the market. The market is driven by externalized and even internalized pressures. These selective pressures drive market. Price, for example, the price of a product being a sort of silent negotiation between a producer and the consumer. The amount of money they need to stay in business versus the amount of money you need to save in order to not spend too much creates a median, and the price sits within the median somewhere. Even Walmart has to operate within that median with its low prices policy. This is just one of the aspects of economic theory that is poorly understood, misrepresented as greed by socialist economists who didn't know any better. Traditional economic theory is very much a proper science. It uses objective evaluation of data, it uses empiricism, it uses logic, all that. And its reception has been amazingly poor because the average person is not a logistician or understands fully empiricism. Partly because those things are not necessarily encouraged in public education, but also because, generally speaking, human beings as a species are bad at using logic, typically. We have the ability, but we're not very good at using it. Our emotions tend to get in the way if we don't have the proper mindset. That being said, I would consider myself to be a rationalist. Maybe not the best one ever, but if people were rationalists, then their emotions would certainly get in the way less. And they'd be able to see things properly. They'd be able to read objective data and come to an objective conclusion. your feelings do get in the way. I realize people will hear that and their amygdala will kick in and they'll be like, defense, defense, you're attacking me. I'm not attacking you. I'm just telling you a harsh truth. Your feelings will get in the way of logic. They usually do. You can't ever do away with your feelings, but they need to take a back seat. Very much so. And if that happened, then I think traditional economic theory would have a greater reception, because it uses so much logic and empiricism. People who don't understand it, logic or empiricism, will reject it out of fear or out of a misguided sense of, oh, that just sounds like greed to me. You know. Then there's Marxist economic theory, which is an alternative traditional economic theory. And every economist who has analyzed it objectively has found it to be incredibly naive. For example, they try to measure the value of an object by the time and energy it took to produce that object. What's interesting about that is that if, let's say, two objects take the same exact amount of time and energy to produce, but one is clearly more useful than the other, you end up distributing the same amount of resources to both objects. Yet one is clearly more important and therefore needs more time and energy. One gets too much time and energy and the other gets too little. And therefore you get a misallocation of resources that creates larger problems down the road. This has occurred in real time in Soviet Russia. This has occurred real time in many other nations that use Marxist economic theory, yet they still refuse to see the truth because, gosh darn it, doesn't it just feel so good? We're preventing greed. We're making sure everybody gets what they need, from each according to the ability, to each according to their need, blah, blah, blah. They reject objective reality. I reject your reality and substitute my own. They should be wearing that shirt everywhere, because that is literally what they do. And that's just one aspect of Marxist economic theory. But that's, I think, the one that was the most relevant to explaining why it is so flawed. That's just one of the many things, is the misallocation of resources, which usually end up resulting in the misallocation of food and water, resulting in starvation. This is why communism, which was listed by Marxists as the end goal, they thought history has an end, and that, being on the right side of history is actually one of their talking points, being that, essentially, communism is the end of the world, and once the state realizes that it's no longer needed, it'll just somehow dissolve, and we'll have anarcho-communism. It's basically wishful thinking. The world just doesn't work like that, no matter how badly you want it to. It just doesn't. But this is ultimately why Marxist economic theory fails, and they never learn. Although those of us who are capitalists, we learn, and learning is a process. It takes time and it takes energy, much like producing a product. And while and really, you can measure learning in the exact same way. You can measure it in time and energy, and in terms of its utility. Learning as utility. Economics can measure more than just money and products. It can also measure learning. And learning in general, again, is a process that takes many years, and oftentimes failure teaches more than success does. You learn more from failure. However, it can be said that you have to be open to learning in order to do so. If you close your mind to the possibility that you're wrong, you won't learn a thing. And that's exactly what happened with these Marxists. They learn nothing because they are closed off to the possibility they can't be wrong. They can be wrong. They don't ever think they can be wrong. They can just assume, if someone resists, they're just not engaging properly. Or maybe they didn't hear me right the first time. Or, that's just the bourgeois consciousness reasserting itself. Yes, due to, I think it was Herbert Marcuse. Maybe it was Herbert Marcuse, or maybe it was Hegel. One of the neo-Marxist philosophers said that there was double consciousness, two consciousness. There was the the authentic consciousness, which is the critical consciousness, and then the bourgeois imposed consciousness. And the goal was to awaken the critical consciousness through special knowledge, which basically is a very Gnostic sort of idea that secret or special knowledge awakens something greater and you transcend the flesh, or in this case, you transcend the bourgeois consciousness. The whole concept being developed as a alternative explanation for why someone wouldn't accept your ideas. Oh, it's not that I'm wrong, it's that their true consciousness is being suppressed by a bourgeois consciousness. Yeah, that's it. I'm always right. Yeah, that's some... Well, that was embarrassing. This is what happens during video production sometimes, folks. Make an adjustment here. I guess that'll do. Now, I obviously need to discuss what happens when politicians don't understand economics. And what generally happens when politicians don't understand economics is that they try to assert dominance over the economy. They try to go for, essentially, command economics. And the problem with command economics is that there are market forces you can control and market forces which you cannot control. And market forces which can be controlled and market forces which cannot be controlled interact with one another and therefore affect one another. And this also creates problems. Once again, in the Soviet Union, they tried to measure public demand for things, and they actually ended up overestimating public demand, and then commanded the economy to produce things that people were demanding, only to realize they'd produced too much, and it started backing up in warehouses. And so they were instructed to continue shipping it to warehouses, even though they were rapidly running out of space. They overestimated the demand. That is one thing that can happen. Another thing that can happen with command economies is that they fail to properly measure... oh shit. I forgot my example. Fuck! Well, I think you generally get the idea of what happens. They fail to measure market forces appropriately, and they end up making mistakes. And those mistakes lead to backing up of warehouses and other malfunctions of the market. Another thing that often happens when they're ignorant of how economics works is they usually end up trying to print more money. And we're all very familiar what happens when you do that. Essentially, you print more money, you devalue the currency, value goes down, poverty goes up, yada yada. This is part of what you might call ordinary market forces, or ordinary day-to-day market forces, being those things that pretty much everyone understands because they interact with them on a regular basis. The ordinary person can understand these forces because they interact with them all the time. Whether you realize it or not, you do interact with supply and demand, and you also interact with things like determination of what the product is, being that they will make a product based on what they think you want, and other similar things. The government doesn't really understand this necessarily because they're not in contact with that everyday interaction. At least they interact with it part of the time, but certainly not all of the time. They fail to properly measure ordinary market forces, which arguably have the greatest impact on the market itself, as these ordinary market forces determine what products exist and how much they are going to end up costing. If a company tries to sell a product for $60 and you buy it for $60, they're going to continue selling it for $60. But if they sell it for $60 and you say you can't pay that, then maybe they start selling it, once they see sales go down, maybe they start selling it for $45. That is another thing that they don't understand, and then they try to quote, fix the problem through subsidies, where they try to subsidize housing that they feel is too expensive. When in reality, if they just eliminated zoning laws, housing could be fixed by making a kind of townhouse situation where you have an upper floor for the middle class or the rich, and a bottom floor for the poor. And they would have space for everyone to live off well enough, but the zoning laws prevent that. That's one of their solutions to ordinary market forces that they don't understand. They don't get it because they're not in touch with they don't have an ear to the ground, and they don't understand economics. These ordinary market forces, if they were interacted with in a healthy way, would help fix the market most of the time. If you think $60 for a product is too much, you stop buying it and then wait to see if it drops in price. You may have to wait a few years, but in the end, you will eventually get your product at a reasonable price. If you keep buying it at 60, it will keep being 60. So I've already spoken which market forces can be controlled, ones that cannot be controlled. So I guess I'll move on to socialism and its various failures. That being said, socialism usually ends up in the starvation of millions due to misallocation of resources, as I previously explained. Agricultural policy also fails because what often happens is with socialism is that they have to have a scary other, right? A boogeyman in order to have the revolution. And what ends up resulting in usually is that they end up boogeymanning something who isn't going along with the program. And as such, what they'll do is they'll take the means of production from that person who knows what they're doing and give it to someone who doesn't know what they're doing. These kinds of socialist policies are an end result of lack of economic literacy in many cases. Because that can happen sometimes even in some capitalist nations. If there is not a constitutional protection for private property, then the government can just take it, give it to someone who doesn't know what the hell they're doing, and it ends up getting wasted. And actually, come to think of it, think about that in terms of taxation. If you tax someone, take their money, and give it to someone else in the form of, say, Social Security money or food stamps, some dumb kid who's just starting out needs a little help, admittedly, but then ends up getting a bunch of money and just ends up blowing it all because he's less than competent with money, because he's only a 19-year-old, adolescent. It's sort of like that. That's one of the failures of socialism. Another failure is because of their unwillingness to admit when they're wrong, they feel the need to silence critics, and that creates a tyranny. When you centralize the economy through the public means, the public ownership of the means of production, which is the definition of socialism, by the way, and then you centralize power, you get an automatic tyranny. It's basically inevitable. Marxist theory is a platform for tyranny. And that's one of its many failures. If we understood traditional economic theory better, the economic theory that works, the theory of Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, these failures could easily be avoided. Then, of course, I also wanted to talk about politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. That being that these are socialist grifters. Because part of socialism is a grift, meaning that you have to sell the idea of revolution to someone, very much like a used car salesman. Especially since capitalism has a powerful ability to drag people up out of poverty by gradually increasing the value of the currency. And essentially being, once the working class are well off, there's no real way they can sell you on their socialist nonsense anymore. So they have to create new sales pitches and new ways to get you hooked on it. If you're more of a traditional Marxist like AOC and Bernie Sanders, then you're still trying to preach to the working class. If you're a neo-Marxist, you're trying to sell to oppressed groups, meaning racial and ethnic minorities, socially underappreciated classes, LGBT, etc. Either way, different song, same dance. It's still the same grift. You're just selling it to someone else, whether it's the old proletariat of the working class or the new proletariat of oppressed peoples, air quote. Bernie Sanders and AOC are used car salesmen. And with AOC it is the most obvious because if you remember, she did that thing where she was talking about kids in cages as concentration camps on the southern border, and then she goes in front of that fence and starts crying and acting all dramatic, claiming she was doing that in front of one of these so-called concentration camps, and it turns out it was actually just an empty parking lot, and the whole thing was a stunt. If you tear away at the mask of these socialist politicians, it will eventually fall away. Here's one in the case of Bernie Sanders. Initially, he said that millionaires and billionaires were the problem, but then he switched to just saying billionaires. Where did the millionaire line go? Bernie became a millionaire, and as soon as he became a millionaire, he dropped it like a bad habit. Proving that Bernie is inconsistent and a turncoat, therefore also a used car salesman of socialism. The real reason why they want you sold on socialism is not to fix your problems, but to control you. Because it centralizes the economy and it centralizes power, creating maximum control by the state. Then all you have to do is get into office and you can control everything. AOC wants to be a dictator. Bernie Sanders wants to be a dictator. Socialists want to be dictators. They'll never say it outright, which is why you have to ignore what they say and instead pay attention to what they do. And sometimes even speech is an action. So instead of paying attention to the speech itself, pay attention to the pattern of speech. Notice what they include and then what they exclude. Notice what they drop from their speech and notice what they add. See the pattern of speech and see the lies. And then you'll start to realize, oh, Bernie just wants to control me. So, honestly, I have this idea, the idea that we need to vet potential candidates before they are considered electable. That being, I think we should have a system where the person on the ballot, whose name appears on the ballot, must first have passed a rigorous battery of tests to make sure that it's safe for them to be elected. First of all, they should be tested for their economic literacy. Right? They should be tested for their economic literacy to make sure that they actually know what they're doing when it comes to the economy. Second of all, they should also be vetted for toxic political ideologies, meaning we should have tests that detect whether or not someone is a socialist or a neo-Nazi or an authoritarian of any sort. So we can have a battery test to detect authoritarians, and to make it functional, we would make sure that the test taker would not be aware that that was being detected in them. Because if they knew it, then they could lie and negotiate around it. We would keep them from knowing it, that they're being tested in that way. We would test them for their virtues, for their ideas, and then for their economic literacy, and then they can be put on the ballot. At the very least, if I had a political party, that's basically how I would do it. I would vet the hell out of people to make sure that they were electable. And then finally, there is the results of failing policies, which we see all around us more and more all the time. We see the rise in gas prices because of Joe Biden, because of his failing policy of pressuring nations that we literally need to buy oil from. He pressures them and bullies them because that's the American way, don't you know? And instead of them bending the knee to Emperor Biden, they just say, okay, have fun with your rising gas prices. We don't have to sell to you. You know, that's another issue. Another issue would be, of course, Biden's policy in regards to how he treats the people. Which, yes, treating your constituents is a policy. What is your constituent policy? Well, Biden's constituent policy is to make big promises and then deliberately, purposefully not deliver. Not by failing to deliver, but by deliberately turning coat and saying, you thought I was going to actually do that for you? And then people who voted for him continue to suffer, and they get Biden remorse. Right. The America that exists today is a result of failing policies due to the lack of understanding of economics and grifting for more power. That's what socialists are. They lack economic literacy, and they just want more power. And that is why economic literacy, or lack of, is so dangerous. Because it invites tyranny and starvation to come into your nation. And that is what presidents like Joe Biden are trying to create with their true and Anana Shibata pressure. If he actually still had a brain left, he would be greatly more effective. But the fact that he does not have a brain left, I think, is something we should be grateful for. Insofar that he cannot effectively assert dominance because he basically has the brain of an old retarded grandpa. Anyway, with that being said, there will be a link in the description below to my books. Please buy, download, and read them. And as always, tschüss, peace.